Good morning, Susanna. How are you today?
I'm doing well in sunny Pittsburgh.
Oh, that is great. Now, are you a native of Pittsburgh?
No, Pittsburgh is my adopted city. You may detect an accent. I am German. I
Okay.
attended law school in the United States, and Pittsburgh is my adopted city, and I am a fan. So,
Okay. That is great. Well, I know that you chair the your firm's international business team. What is that? Tell me about what that entails. Tell me about the international business team at Dentons.
it really consists of two pieces, and maybe going into it historically kind of explain
Okay.
the development of that team. Um, Being German, I've always had an interest in international law, and I liked Pittsburgh and decided to practice international law from Pittsburgh. Heading out of law school. And in those days, it was a little bit more unusual than it is today. We've lived through COVID and can connect from wherever we are. 10, 20 years ago, it was more unusual to practice international law in Pittsburgh, but that's
Mm-hmm.
what we decided to do. So the group tends to international clients coming to the United States to do business here and have developed what we call the soft landing program. And out of
Okay.
that grew the trade practice, the export import trade practice that, frankly, within the last 5 years or so has quadrupled in size. We engaged additional attorneys in that field as trade, and everybody reading the paper can see how we impose additional tariffs, how we impose additional export control measures. And so
Mm-hmm.
responding to that need, that part of our practice has grown incredibly.
Okay. And so it's mostly, I guess they would call this inbound business, mostly foreign companies trying to do business in the US, or is it split pretty evenly between that and US companies like on the export controls work and such?
I'm glad you're asking. We do both. But the majority is really inbound. Yes, we do assist companies do business overseas, but really what that entails is finding somebody in that country who is like the Susanne Cook overseas to do what we do here. And ultimately, we just hand it off to a good resource. Now, I think that's valuable for a client, but really where we are more engaged is on the inbound side. And then for on the trade side, it's also U.S. companies who do business internationally and need U.S. export control advice. So
Okay. Okay, that's helpful. And so help us like understand. I love like case studies, examples. Could you give us an example? And if you need to anonymize the client's name, of course, feel free to do so. But maybe give us an example of like a couple engagements that might be representative and maybe kind of lay out sort of the fact pattern. And again, anonymize as appropriate.
right, of course, of course. A simple case study would be a client who is engaged in exporting and at one point wonders whether be it software or a hard product, is export controlled and
Mhm.
reaches out to us, and we look at the product and assist in classification as to whether this item is controlled or not. If we determine it's not controlled, that's wonderful, the end of the story. The next step may be that it is controlled. And at that point, we look at past exports to see if any of those should have been pursued under a license. And that could be a license from commerce, it could be a license under ITAR, which is military. And ultimately, depending on the circumstances, that may lead to what we call a prior disclosure, where the client approaches through us, the regulatory agency in charge, and discloses the issues in the past. And I have to say that generally U.S. agencies are pretty forgiving. If the prior disclosure is done well, the circumstances aren't too egregious.
Sure.
Generally, I have to say our prior disclosures, we've had great success in coming clean, and the client then can walk away knowing that this is not in their past and could pop up any moment.
Well, I'm really, just as a US citizen, I'm really pleased to hear that, because it would seem like that's the system that we would want. That now I'm presuming, though, the flip side of that, if the client does not identify the issue and the government agency somehow identifies it, then the consequences are maybe not as favorable to the client. Is that a fair assumption?
That is, yes, that is the dynamic here. And really also, I always say there's one thing worse than not doing a prior disclosure and doing a bad prior disclosure.
Okay.
Really, at that point, doing a prior disclosure means full disclosure, because if a partial disclosure is done and the agencies find out that this was really a very calculated prior disclosure with keeping in the background some of the items that the client wasn't ready to share, that is actually viewed as an aggravating effect.
So it's almost, so in the sequence, the worst thing to do is an incomplete prior disclosure. And then the next worst would be no disclosure and the agency comes calling and you just, plead ignorance. So you actually get in typically the client would get in less trouble for just being clueless, if you will, than for strategically disclosing only some stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
That goes to knowledge, right?
Sure.
It is negligence, gross negligence, or this now goes to intentional misconduct. And with respect to intentional misconduct, even if the client decides not to do a prior disclosure for whatever reason, and there are valid reasons, what we consistently counsel, the behavior cannot continue, because once it has been determined that something should be corrected, if the client continues doing that, now it becomes with knowledge, intention. And so, yes, it has to change one way or the other.
Okay.
So, yes.
Yeah.
So that is on the export side. We also, in the trade, we do the importation side, and it's rather similar. And again, like the export side, we like to stay ahead of trouble. I always say we can do it this way or this way. And this way is prospectively working with a client, developing a program where violations are likely not to occur, or we can assist after a violation occurred. And we much prefer to be on the front end. And I think really the client is served better.
Now, on the import side, where does the trouble lie? Is it failing to pay like an import tariff, or?
And there I can tell you, we used to have tariffs averaging of maybe 0.4 to 0.6%. There were a few, maybe 2-3% duties. And companies and the regulatory agencies as well did not pay a whole lot of attention to payment of duties. But now we have the Section 305 20% duties that are imposed on pretty much all goods from China. We have other tariffs similar to the Section 232 imposed on most of steel. that we import. So now everybody pays attention, as you can imagine. And
Sure.
also the incentive of trying to find a legal way to not pay those is much greater than it was a couple of years ago. At the same time, yes, customs pays attention much more than they did 5 years ago, because we're talking
Okay.
real money now.
Yeah, yeah, it's much more material. So I'm really not familiar with the import tariffs. How do they logistically work? Does the importing company that's subject to the 25% tariff, are they responsible for like remitting that to like I say voluntarily, but is it their responsibility? Or is there somehow is that basically how it works?
Yes, the system works through customs brokers.
Okay,
And so it's rare that a company will perform their own entry. So they engage a
I
customs
see.
broker. And the customs broker is like the intermediary in this system. And yes, all duties are being paid through that system. A
Okay,
significant part of determining what duties are due is the what we call the harmonized tariff schedule classification of the
okay,
product. Believe it or not, it's kind of mind-boggling, but any product in the world has an HTS classification.
okay,
So, and it's can get tricky, particularly sometimes products evolve that were not even there when the HTS was developed, but still
okay.
somehow we interpret it for those products to be classified in this HTS system. Sometimes reasonable people can disagree on
Okay.
classification, and there's a ruling system. One can go approach customs and request a ruling, but really it's like anything, garbage in, garbage out. If there
Yeah.
is an incorrect determination on the HTS classification, only bad things can follow. But
Yeah. And I'm guessing the reason that, that there may be a difference of opinion in the classification is because one product may have a higher import tariff than another. So thus the client seeks to make the case that it should fall under the lower tariff classification.
Absolutely, absolutely. And even when we submit rulings, it's a little bit like, even court filings, you kind of make your best case as
Mm,
to why we believe this product falls in the category that we would prefer it to be in. Of course, we have to be accurate and correct, but yes, we stress the factors that would make it more likely for a product to be classified in our desired classification. The,
okay. And again, the process, so the customs broker is actually the one doing the classification of the product.
they do. However, they work on very, very small margins.
Right.
And so in difficult cases, yeah, they will make a suggestion, but ultimately it's always the importer's responsibility. It's kind of like a
Okay.
tax return. You engage
Gotcha.
your CPA, but if something goes wrong, it's the taxpayer. And
Yeah.
here it is the importer of record who would be on the hook. So in difficult cases, or if there is a whole lot of money involved, we get involved as a law firm in
Okay.
classification as well. And it's, the sums of money could be staggering.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the product comes in, the customs broker either proactively or independently will do a classification of the item or maybe a preliminary classification, or if it's not clear, they'll perhaps reach out to the client for guidance. Am I right so far?
That's
And,
right.
and then the product comes in, and then how soon does the company have to remit those tariffs? Is it a weekly process, a monthly
It's
process, quarterly?
it's a simultaneous. process,
simultaneous
process.
and
And
obviously, but I'm guessing if they receive the product, if the product lands at 4 p.m. on a Tuesday, they don't have to remit the money at 4:01 p.m. on Tuesday. I assume there's some
there's some
time.
leeway, and there is a customs bond in the background
Okay.
backing up the payments. So as I increase their imports, or they may not even increase them, but there is now all of a sudden a dumping duty applied to the product, or a 25% additional tariff because the items are shipped from China, the bond may have to be increased because it doesn't cover the standard amounts anymore.
I see. And the bond, is that required by customs?
Yes.
And every company has to have one, or when they get to be a certain size?
It's through the broker. The broker
I see.
always, yes, it's part of the system.
Okay, yes, so every product that gets imported is somehow falls under the umbrella of a particular bond.
Unless it's a one-off, like you and I just importing things, we're not under that bond system. But in professional companies who import as a business, yes, a bond would be involved.
So is there a threshold where those tariffs come into play? Like if I buy $100 item from China and I'm buying it with the intent of selling it in the US and I sell it for $150, I mean, is there a minimum threshold? $800. Okay.
Yes. And this is actually subject to scrutiny, political scrutiny by now at this point, because these de minimis entries are subject to no duties. And in this age where everybody is ordering stuff online, and sometimes these are big businesses who are shipping entries, hundreds of entries every day into the United States to the ultimate customer under the $800 exclusion limitation. And a lot of them are country of origin China, which is it's under scrutiny. China is, as a country, is under scrutiny. These de minimis shipments are currently scrutinized, and I would frankly expect there to be additional regulations by the end of this year or the beginning of next year, just cutting back on these exclusions, because you can see the Congress is suspicious that this is being abused by larger companies.
Right. Yeah, and is the 800 per order, or is it a cumulative amount for a period of time?
It's per entry per day. So if you as a consumer are the recipient of, I don't know what you ordered online, that would be, let's say, $600 worth.
Right. So the strategy, if I imported, $20,000 of goods annually from China, and I divide that by, 250 business days, I think that's like about $100 like a day, if I'm doing my math right. 250, 2,500. Yeah. So that's about $100 a day. So if I had that, my strategy then would be to ensure that the imports are staggered such that no one day $800 is imported, right? I mean, that's the strategy. I can imagine where that'd be a complicated thing to try to pull off, the coordination and the timing. And it wouldn't be so much there, but if you're doing like $200,000 a year, where you divide that by $250 and it's, and you're approaching $800 a day, then I would imagine that it'd be very difficult to try to manage the timing of all of that.
And it's also an issue, frankly, on customs side, because those small orders typically are not scrutinized. And now if we are scrutinizing them, that's also an increased bureaucracy. So there are considerations here on all sides. At the same time, there are in place, as we all know, increased regulations on imports from China. All these Section 301 tariffs are mostly from China, on goods from China. And the one of the proposals is that these de minimis items still would be subject to the 25% Section 301 duties, which they currently are not.
I see.
So
So you're saying that $800 threshold would no longer apply. So if you import an item that costs $2, you still have to pay 50 cents.
But then again, the bureaucracy, right? That
Understood.
increases. So there is a real. It's not an easy issue, but
Okay.
yes, it's mostly targeted really at China.
Yeah. So one of the things I follow closely, it's just a hobby of mine, is the electric vehicle space. And I don't know if that's something you pay much attention to, but China produces, like, I think the latest stats I heard, 70 or 80% of the electric vehicles produced in the world are produced in China. And they have tremendous excess capacity. I want to say they produce like 15 to 20 million electric vehicles a year, but they have capacity for like 50 million. So of course, they're looking to export them. And so one of the ways that they're looking to get around this is to take advantage of NAFTA, or whatever the new NAFTA name is. What's the name of the new?
USMCA.
Yes. So what they're doing then is they're building factories in Mexico, and then, importing it that way. And what's interesting is that's, like, historically seemed to be appropriate because it's then a Mexican produced product. It just so happens to be owned by a Chinese company. But the talking, or the suggested proposals, I think by both parties, certainly by the Trump administration, is to disallow those products to be exempt from the import tariffs. I'm just curious, have you heard anything about this? And what your thoughts are?
Followed the electric vehicles, but that doesn't surprise me at all, because those issues are always raised and trying to fight circumvention, where the country of origin is being changed artificially or legitimately, right? And that decision and determination is always in the eye of the beholder. And there are significant incentives to try to deviate from the country of origin determination of China. And at the same time, the United States is investigating these issues all the time. And yes, there are exclusions I'm aware of for country of origin, or to no longer benefit from USMCA for certain specific items. For example, another item is steel from Russia. We impose more restrictions on that, even if it's channeled through Mexico. So, and really, I mentioned that our trade group has increased. Well, as these issues increase, it really requires more attention and more expertise to advise clients on what is permitted and what is not permitted. And of course, as a U.S. importer, you always want to import items with the least amount of tariff, and it can get tricky.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Well, good. Well, that's really helpful, because the funny thing is, our practice is all export driven, but the average person thinks export is a part of a compound word called import export. And they just assume that we're well versed in all the import rules. And I always have to keep telling people, it's just, that's not what we're focused on. So my knowledge of import rules is now, infinitely higher than it was an hour ago. So thank you for that, Susanne.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And I can see how clients view that. To them, it's just things that cross the border, whichever way.
Right. Yeah, it's all the same to them. So what would you say are the characteristics for you of like an ideal client? Like, because like I'm guessing somebody who imports, $2,000 a year of stuff from outside the US and they have a business that does $50,000 a year in revenue. I'm guessing that's like that's not a good fit for you. It's just like overkill, right? There's just not. So help me understand just like maybe you just pick the perfect client. What would the characteristics be?
There are really two buckets, I would say. The one is, of course, we like working with large importers and exporters who do this all the time, who have a traffic department who
Okay.
manages these functions. And as it gets to be, let's say, like you mentioned, the electric vehicle, to a very specific case where they need outside assistance, that would be then our role. And
Okay.
that is an ideal client. There is another bucket, and the other bucket is really the growing business. If you are the company that imports $100,000 a year of
Okay.
whatever, often really the company doesn't even realize they're importing, and they often do not pay a whole lot of attention to that. But
Sure.
in the way our international world is going, they probably will increase the imports and their exports over the next couple of years. And to me, it's always best to counsel that company on how to develop a department that looks at these issues and remains compliant, not when
Okay.
they are now importing or exporting 100 million. You want to catch them before that.
Sure.
And
Sure.
I don't know when that ideal spot is to where they
Okay.
don't get into trouble. As I said, we always want to counsel companies before they get into trouble.
I've
And
gotcha.
the function is a little bit too on how precarious the items is. If everything, let's say $500,000, all imports from China, I would take a look at that.
Okay.
Those are imports that will be scrutinized. Or if you export and you export 500,000 of items that are export controlled, you need to pay attention. So there is a little bit of an overlay. How controlled is the item? And if it's just, I always use the example of brooms, where you
Okay.
import brooms or export brooms, not regulated. Of course,
Okay.
then the threshold would be higher. You're
I
really
understand.
not under much of a scrutiny at all. Not that there are none, but it's much less. And really, I would love to get all these companies at the sweet spot. Sure, they grow appropriately and have a system in place, because it's always harder. If you get
Yeah.
somebody with 100 million of imports, they don't even have a good system. That's a difficult task.
Yeah. Yeah. So just to recap, so kind of the two perfect types are one would be like a large company with a relatively sophisticated internal traffic group that's, is basically set up for success and, they kind of know what they're doing. And then they call on you for specific arcane cases or situations where they can pull you in, kind of as the expert. Now, do you do opinion letters? You all do opinion letters in your practice?
We do. We do. And opinion letters is really on both sides, export control and on customs. It's only the agencies who can give a binding ruling on
Gotcha.
how these items are classified. We will give opinions. What that will do, it will mitigate culpability. It
Right.
doesn't mean we say we are 100% right all the time, because only the agencies can give these rulings.
Of course.
But it will go a long way to mitigating any exposure because the company obviously went out of their way.
Yeah, well, and they relied, I think the key term is the reliance. They relied on your opinion. And so,
Correct.
like you said, that then gives them, protection from, the extreme impacts of regulatory rulings.
Correct. Correct. And yes, we will give opinions. Of course, a better way, if it's possible, is to get a binding ruling because
Yeah,
it's
of course.
actually, in a way, often less work to get a binding
Oh,
ruling
is
than it
it?
is to
Okay.
do
Yeah,
our own.
I can see why, because you only have to provide enough data to satisfy the regulatory agency. Whereas for an opinion letter, you maybe have to be more comprehensive to encompass all these different factors.
Correct. Correct.
Yeah, that makes sense. So this, as we're nearing the end here, so I'm going to put you on the spot with this one. Okay, are you ready? So
Okay.
I'm guessing that Dentons is not the only law firm in the world that's involved in international trade. Is that probably a fair assumption?
That's a fair
Um, so
assumption.
why, when your clients select you specifically or the firm, if you've ever asked them, hey, how did you choose us? Why did you choose us? Why do you keep using us? What's the response you get from your clients as far as why they use the firm?
I believe that they use us because we are extremely business oriented. And a
Okay.
lot of the other trade outfits are much more theoretical and
Okay.
professorial. And really, I mean, going back full circle to my introduction, how we got into this. We got into this because we have had clients in that space that we wanted to assist. And
Okay.
so we're a little bit more of like an in-house legal department, how we look at this. We're very practical. What can the company do to implement these rules and regulations with undue burden? We don't just
Okay.
counsel, these are the rules, this is what you have to do. We always take it a step further and assist the client in finding the best way to be compliant. Uh,
Okay.
and that's in our blood.
Okay.
Any piece of advice we give, we always ask ourselves, and we look at it from the perspective of the client, the company.
Okay.
How can they do that? Because one can give all kinds of theoretical advice, which is good advice, but it just doesn't work. And we always ask that question. So I think that's an advantage. The other advantage is just the location, Pittsburgh. Our cost structure tends to be more competitive
I
than
see. New
our,
York.
yes, our competitors often sit in New York, Manhattan,
Mhm.
in Chicago, Miami, the
Yeah.
big trade centers. Now this
Yeah.
is
LA.
changing, yes. So our cost structure is a Pittsburgh cost
Yeah.
structure.
And then I suppose for a client who's actually based in Pittsburgh, it's a, kind of a bonus or that makes you
Correct.
uniquely attractive to have a local resource with the international capabilities that you all have.
Correct. Correct.
Okay. So I've got only two more questions. One's an easy one. One's going to be the hardest that you're going to have. So the easy one is there anything I didn't ask you that you wish I had asked you? Anything we didn't cover?
No, I would say that the one area we all believe that trade compliance will continue on this trajectory of increased attention and I think duties will continue to increase. Export control requirements will increase as well.
Mhm.
So I think this trajectory will continue for anybody doing business internationally.
Yeah.
And really, this is one of the areas where it does not matter how our election will turn out. That's the trajectory. Our world
Yeah.
is more complicated and increased trade rules will
Okay.
continue to apply.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because for the listener who's thinking, well, yeah, this is kind of a problem now, but I'm sure it's just temporary. You know, if the right person wins the election, then this is going to go away. So thank you for saying that they need to get that naive thought out of their mind, right? It's only going to increase.
It's continuing. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
and so it sounds like the real takeaway is the companies involved in international trade should just accept that and expect the increase in it, and just basically be prepared for that.
And for business, it's always a cost benefit analysis, right?
Of course, yeah,
And the cost will not go away.
exactly. Yep, no, that makes sense. So the last question, so this is the tougher one, and it's okay if you need to take a bit to think about it. So if you could go back in time and give advice to your 25-year-old self, what advice might you give to yourself?
When the 25-year-old myself was mostly interested always in international trade, but I was
Okay,
interested in outbound transactions, doing joint ventures in
okay,
Brazil, in Russia, in travel. And really being in private practice in Pittsburgh, that turned out to be a bad business plan. Because
okay,
if I did my job well, like I said, I would find the perfect match in those countries to tend to the client. And I might continue having a supervisory role or occasionally advise the client. But if it was the perfect match, even that would start being less and less. So yes, the more focusing on the inbound transaction is the better business.
okay. So the advice you'd give is focus more on that import transactions sooner than later.
That's right. And on export transactions dealing with U.S. companies. But don't expect on the outbound side to continue to do the work if they form a company, if they outside of the United States. And it's
Okay,
logical, very logical, but the 25-year-old me did not see that.
sure. And what about like on a maybe a more personal perspective, advice you might give yourself of just, kind of lessons you've learned more on the personal side, work more, work less, travel more, travel less, eat more desserts, eat less desserts. Any advice you'd have for your 25-year-old self personally?
The advice is you need a good team.
Okay,
You just need a good team and pay attention to building that team. And it also, you alluded to it, balance of life kind of situations.
hmm,
One person can't do it all. It's the team that performs.
understood. Well, that is really great advice. Well, Susanna, this has really been fun for me, and I've learned so much about import items that I didn't know anything about. So I really appreciate your time, and I hope you have a great afternoon.
Well, thank you, David. You too.